Thanks for tuning in to today's podcast. Please remember that all of the information in this podcast episode is limited to general information only. That means the information is not specific to you, your needs, goals, or objectives, so you should seek the advice of a licensed and trusted financial professional before acting on the information. And before you acquire or apply for a financial product, please read the PDS or product disclosure statement, which should be available on the issuer's website. Lastly, please keep in mind that past performance is not indicative of future performance. In this episode of the Australian Finance Podcast, Kate and I are talking about the different ways to invest $10,000. Whether you're investing in a more conservative way, you're just getting started, you're more experienced, or kind of everything in between, Kate and I share some ideas of how we'd invest $10,000 if we had $10,000, or how we're already investing. We hope you enjoy this episode of the Australian Finance Podcast. Kate, welcome to this episode of the Australian Finance Podcast.
Thanks, Owen. Good to be back.
We're doing this remotely again, aren't we?
Yes, I'm actually recording in the car today, so I thought that we'll see if the audio is any better.
Yeah, we'll see. It's hopefully we can do some stuff with the audio and for everyone it's okay. If it isn't, we apologize in advance. We're going to do our best to make sure you can listen to the episode as best you can.
Everyone's using the internet right now to watch Netflix, so it's a little bit challenging to find a good time off peak to get good bandwidth.
It is. But at the same time, I think that makes everyone a little bit more forgiving when it comes to these types of recordings. And hey, we're just two people that just talk about things that we like doing, and we share that with a community of people who are our listeners, which is great. So Kate, tell me, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we've had a lot of people ask us, is now the time to invest? How do I start investing? What do I actually buy? So today we're going to discuss a little bit about if you've got 10K or some money right now and you want to figure out what to do with it, where would you put that 10K now? And what are we doing with our own investing plans at the moment? Yeah, and it's such a good topic because so many people kind of think of investing as, I need a few $1,000s, and naturally $10,000 is kind of like a round figure. $5,000 is another one. Even though we say you only need $500 to get started, this is investing in the share market, of course, or in ETFs. But some people want $5,000 so they can diversify, or they want $10,000. I guess one of the things for us here, and me in particular, is on the back of around about 600,000 people applying to get money from super, which we covered in the previous podcast. And it's one of those things where, yes, it may be a last resort for people. So we've talked about in the past how if you are applying to get money from super, you probably want to exhaust your other options. And then you want to think about if, you're a reliable person with money. So have you invested before? Are you thinking healthily about what you can do with the money rather than just spending it? All those types of things. So if you need a refresher on getting access to super, go back to the previous episode. But Kate, tell me, have you considered getting any money out of super? Personally, because I've actually been contributing some extra to super, I'm not thinking about it too much at the moment. I'm luckily enough, I actually had sort of some extra funds because I was not going to Europe anymore, given the circumstances. So I did have an emergency fund plus travel fund as well. So I've got a little bit of cash extra, so I don't need that immediate release of money, which is I'm very thankful for, and it's sort of worked out, I guess. I mean, it's sad not being in London, but I've got a little bit of extra money at the moment, so I haven't personally thought about taking money out of super, but I definitely know a lot of people 600,000 people are thinking about doing it.
Yeah, it's a huge thing, right? And I mean, it's fortuitous for you that you happen to save all this money to go away. You don't need it. You don't need to use it on your holiday, but you have it now available because of all the other things that have happened, cancelled holidays, coronavirus, all that type of stuff. So it's fortuitous. I guess there's a silver lining there is that you've got the money put aside. But okay, so I'm in a slightly different boat. So if I was looking at this, being an investor, being someone who knows, I believe, how to invest money, I believe...
We hope.
We hope. I believe that I can invest better than my super fund. And I don't mean that in an egotistical way. I just mean it because I've been investing long enough. I believe I can. And I think, if I'm let's say I'm in an indexed investment option. So we've talked about index funds in the past. And let's say the super fund is investing my money in an indexed option. There's no reason why necessarily you can't take that money and do exactly what the super fund's doing in your own name. So take that money out of super fund, put it into a brokerage account and invest it. And so if I look at my super fund and my strategy at the moment, most of it's in Vanguard index funds. And we know that we can buy a Vanguard index fund in an ETF form on the share market. So we can open a brokerage account, find the Vanguard fund that my super fund is invested in, and just buy it in the brokerage account. It's really not that difficult. But I guess the difference is, there's some differences. Well, obviously super is, a slightly lower tax. We can't access it to us however old, maybe say 70 by the time we get there. But if it's in our brokerage account, we could access it in 20 or 30 years. We could access it anytime we like. The risk here, the reason why people don't want to talk about this kind of thing, and particularly people like us, is because there are risks involved with taking money from super. One of them is that, you take money out of super and you don't have anything left in there. So your retirement's gone up in smoke. You're not necessarily a responsible person. So when I say responsible person, it's really upon us to recognize if we're responsible, right? If we have, a dependency of some sort, if we have an addiction where we spend money frivolously, or if we do something that's kind of unhealthy for us financially, there's a lot of risk to taking money out of super, not to mention insurance inside of super, right?
Yeah, and it's also, we have the super funds look at a really long-term time horizon. They're investing this money sort of infinitely for members, and because there's always new members coming in and other people sort of getting to retirement age. And I think it's really hard for us personally in our minds to think about, can we invest this money well for the next 40 years so we're going to have enough for retirement? And so I think it's a really different mindset that we personally have compared to the super fund. And do we think we can steward this 10 grand over the next 40 years as well as or better than the super fund? I think that's sort of the big thing I would be thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you and I come at it from two different perspectives, right? Because I've always been a very hands-on investor and I've been doing it for a long time. Whereas you're kind of a bit newer to it, but you understand, enough about it to probably do it yourself, but maybe you don't have that, I guess, conviction in your abilities just yet. Maybe I could be wrong there, but, I totally could be. But I think that's kind of like, that gives people an example of, even say where you are, you're thinking maybe it's not the best idea. So maybe if you're even more of a novice or completely new to investing, maybe you think, yeah, I could take the money out, but it would be better if I just kept it in there. And that's completely reasonable. There's a full spectrum of people that listen to this podcast. There's people that have never invested, people who don't necessarily want to invest. So if you're like one of the 90% of people in Australia, and I just plucked that number out of thin air, and you couldn't be bothered with your finances, you're just like, yeah, it goes into my bank account, I put some in super, blah, 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 who cares? Doing this, taking money from super is probably a very bad idea because you're not going to be engaged with the money and you might just end up just, I won't use the phrase I was going to call into action, but you might just end up doing something with it that you regret. And that is worst case scenario, right?
Because it's going to have a big impact over the next 40 years, whether you take that money and do something with it or just take that money and it disappears into thin air on various expenses.
Yeah, and that's it. Look, there's the people who need the money right now, and that's just like a no-brainer.
Yeah, absolutely. If you need to pay rent, you've got to pay rent.
That's it. You just got to do it. And, sometimes the supplements and the job seekers and all that won't actually be enough. Okay, so that's kind of like our disclaimer, like our caveat. Like, if you are not engaged with your finances, if you don't want to set aside up to an hour a day, if you don't want to spend the next couple of weeks while you're in isolation learning about your finances and really getting on top of it, you could probably stop listening now. The rest of the conversation is probably not for you. But if you're like most of our listeners and you are engaged, which is the reason you're listening to this podcast in the first place, then you can continue to listen on, and we're going to throw some examples at you and some, I guess, just where to invest, how you could think about it. So, Kate, if you had $10,000, you already said your dollar cost average. But if you had $10,000, if I go, here, you have to do something with this money, what would you do with it?
If I had to invest it all at once today, I'd probably put it in a diversified mix of ETFs, maybe pick one that copies the ASX 200, and then one that's investing in the international top 500. So there's a few different, we've talked about in the past, but examples of providers like Vanguard and BetaShares that offer these ETFs. So I'd probably just, if I had to pick something today without doing too much research, I'd just go with an Australian and an international ETF. But I think personally, I am continuing to invest in the market, but through a dollar cost averaging approach. So just adding a little bit each week instead of putting all that money in at once, because I think the next 12 months is so uncertain and we have no idea what's going to happen and things are in limbo. So it's definitely worth taking your time. I think now is not the time to rush in and put your whole 10 grand in at once. It's a good opportunity to learn as you slowly put the money into the market.
Absolutely. And that's one thing that I've said to our members. I've said to them, I'm going to make a commitment to you that I'm going to release a buy recommendation for each of the next 6 months. So I'm going to release 6 new buy ideas and put my money into them. So that's kind of jumping on top of your dollar cost averaging strategy. If you had $10,000, you might make a plan to yourself, over the next 10 months, I'm going to invest $1,000 a month. Not $10,000 all at once, but $1,000 a month. So that means if it falls from here, if the stock market falls in the next month, you're going to be buying at lower prices. If it goes up, well, you'll be glad that you bought some last month at lower prices. And so you kind of capture this long-term natural uptrend in the market rather than trying to just time it and throw it all in at once. You can just you can just release it slowly. So dollar cost averaging, and we talk about goals versus habits. Habits is dollar cost averaging. It's buying regularly and just doing it rain, hail, or shine. So you mentioned that. So you mentioned that you buy a diversified mix of ETFs, one that maybe invests in international shares, one that invests in Australian shares. You mentioned some names like Vanguard, who's an issuer, BetaShares, who's an issuer. Another one is iShares. You've got ETF Securities, VanEck. There's heaps of different ETF providers out there which you can get started with. The best thing to do, I would say, is probably just go away and Google those ETFs, read some news about them, read the PDS, which should be available on their websites. Anything else, Kate? Anything else you'd recommend for people wanting to learn more?
Yeah, I think if you just start on each of their websites, and I think if you go back to our very beginning of the podcast series, we did talk in detail about how to pick and sort of select ETFs. I guess the first thing's working out what is your time frame. Are you thinking long term with this money, or are you wanting only a year or two? Do you think you want to buy a house in the next 5 years? I think at the moment it's quite hard to think about long term when we've got so much happening in the world around us. So that's why I think taking a slow approach where you learn as you go is good. But definitely work out, do you want to be invested in Australia and the international economy? There's ETFs where you can pick specific sectors, like you might want to invest in a healthcare ETF or technology. So you can sort of pick where you think the world's going. But definitely have a look at each of the providers' websites, and then you can filter through and have a look at the management fees and things like that when you're exploring these ETFs a bit further. And then there's plenty of options as well. If you go to your broker like NabTrade or CommSec, they've got filters as well that you can have a look at.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Just go to the websites, go to your brokers, filter for them, go back and this is a really important one. Go back and listen to our episode, because we're not going to go back over everything that we've talked about in ETFs or for ETFs in this one episode, but please go back. I think it was how to pick and choose ETFs was one of our most popular episodes to date, and it's easy to see why. Okay, so I might be a little bit more specific and throw out a name or two for people to I guess something that as I guess a starting point for them. So I've given a label to effectively 3 different types of people, right? So I'm going to start off with Lazy Susan, who's, if I could describe her, she'd be like the CBF, if you know what that means for the kids out there. who cannot be bothered with finance, basically. And if I was meeting with Susan and she came in and she said, I really couldn't care less about finance. I've got $10,000 and I just want to put it somewhere where I know I'm not going to touch it and it's going to do good things for me. So one of the things that I would probably tell her would be, go and check out an ETF that invests in shares. Maybe you could get one that invests in Australian shares. So one that we've recommended in our ETF service is the A200 ETF. So it's a super low cost ETF that invests in the top 200 shares. And then we've got another one, which we haven't recommended, but it's obviously a massive no-brainer for people who just cannot be bothered. And it's the Vanguard Diversified High Growth Fund. It's like an ETF, but it does all of the investing. So I think we've talked about this on the show before, but basically, you'd invest in it. And then when you invest in that one thing, it automatically sends the money to all of the different ETFs that are high growth or diversified. So VDHG is the ticker code for that ETF, but that's kind of like the absolute no fuss investment.
Yeah, and I think BetaShares now offers some of those diversified ETFs as well, where they do it all for you. You don't have to buy Australia and international and small cap. You can just get one solution that fulfills everything. That's
it. And there are obviously risks involved with all of this, so you should always read the PDSs. But these types of ETFs are what we call diversified ETFs. And so instead of picking, like you said, Kate, like one for shares, one for bonds, one's for cash investments, one for property investments, it does it all. You just pick the one that you think you're most comfortable with, and you can just make one investment. So another thing that people might be considering, and it's something that my wife and I are considering, is, and I've given them the name of Peter Property. Now imagine there's a young person or a young couple out there who can access money, let's say $10,000, and they want to put it towards a house deposit. If you want to buy a house in the next 1 to 3 years, do not put the money in the share market. Like you said, anything can happen. So what I would do is I would take that money out and I'd put it in a high interest savings account. Something simple. Just stick it in there. You're not going to get a lot of interest, but that's just the price. And you could use that money to boost the deposit for your property. And if you're a first home buyer, one thing I will tell you is there's a thing at the moment. It's called the Australian Government First Home Deposit Scheme. Have you heard of this, Kate?
Yeah. I think we've discussed it before, but I think we came to the conclusion it sounded quite complicated, and how the process would be to actually release your money.
I think this is a different one.
Oh, we're talking about a different scheme.
Yeah. So there's a first home super saver scheme, which is this super strategy where you put money in and you take money out, and that's all that's a bit up in the air for me. But the other one is where you only need a 5% deposit, and the government takes out the other 15%, so you don't have to pay LMI. Obviously, there are some eligibility criteria, but effectively you can apply for loans at participating lenders, and spaces are limited in this scheme. I really don't like the name scheme, but we'll come back to that another time.
Sounds like there's sort of mischief.
It does. In this scheme, you can use only a 5% deposit. You got to make sure, you got to prove that you can save up and you have a job and all this type of thing. So it only applies to certain people in certain areas where they buy their house. But I'll put some links in the show notes for this too. You only need a 5% deposit. The government effectively goes in with you for the other 15%. So you get to a 20% deposit effectively. The bank gives you a loan, but you pay interest on the full loan. So that's an interesting thing which you should speak to your mortgage broker about, or speak to your financial advisor. It's something that I'm looking into because I have never bought a property, which is probably a shock to some people. I've always been a renter. So that's what I'd say to Peter Property. I'd say, you know what, if you have money and you want to buy a house in the next 3 years, don't risk it. And the final one, which I haven't come up with a name for, it's kind of like this person that's not Lazy Susan, they're not Peter Property, but they're kind of everyone else. They're this long-term investor who wants to get ahead, who's got $10,000, and they're thinking, well, what do I do? And I would say, well, if you haven't already learned about investing, you haven't gone back and listened to our podcast, just do that as a first point of call. You know, we say 15 minutes or an hour a day would be everything you need, and in 3 to 6 months, you'd be well ahead of 95% of the population in terms of your financial literacy. But you could start investing in a mixture of shares and ETFs, and You could start saving for an investment property or saving for your first house. You could kind of do all the things at once. So what I would do is I would look at these ETFs and I would aim to invest in a certain number of ETFs, say, a handful of ETFs, and then I would just keep adding to them over time. And then once you get to a certain level where you're comfortable with your knowledge and you're comfortable with the commitment it takes to understand shares and businesses and all that type of thing, you might try to add shares to your portfolio. So it's kind of like beginners start with ETFs. As you become more advanced, you start to invest in shares as well, and you start to just invest in assets, really.
And I think we often talk about the core and satellite approach, especially if you're getting started, having ETFs as the basis of your portfolio, especially over the few years while you're learning, and then starting to invest and investigate shares on the side, sort of on the outskirts of your portfolio. Especially, that's sort of what I do while I'm learning about shares, and who knows if that approach will change in the future. But it's certainly interesting watching the market.
Yeah, I think it would be a mistake if people who have never invested in shares all of a sudden find themselves with $10,000 and they're just like, I'm just going to go and put all of my money in one share, or I'm going to put it in these handful of shares that look good, or I read about on a forum somewhere. That would be a huge mistake. I think first things first, have you invested before? Start with small amounts, build your base, build that core. So we talk about this in one of the free courses that we have, just like talk about the building out this core. Think about it like the planets with the moon that goes around it, like the satellite. You want the core of your portfolio to be full of really defensive, diversified, low-cost things that you don't really have to worry about. And then if you're so inclined, you can add other things like individual shares, or you can add, who knows, maybe if you're crazy enough, you can add Bitcoin and all those types of things too. It's not for me.
But if you have been interested in investigating and learning about shares, I mean, I can't think of a better time than now. Like, all you need is internet and the desire to actually learn and do some research. So it's really a perfect time to just have a play and have a look. Yeah,
totally. It's one of those times where you're kind of cooped up anyway. You can try and be healthy, and that's a really important thing no matter what. You can try and learn some things. You can maybe study like you're doing. You can just read a book, or you can sit down and listen to a podcast for half an hour like this one. You can use this time productively, do all the things you don't necessarily have time for in your normal world while you're cooped up inside.
You've probably listened to the podcast and thought about a lot of things that you've always wanted to do to sort out your finances, and you've always thought about putting together a budget and a sort of a 10-year plan. And I mean, now's the time to sort of sit down and dream about what you want to do in your future, and sort of take the time to learn about your finances, because that could be an amazing investment in your time right now that will pay off over your lifetime.
That's the thing. And you only need to learn all of this stuff once, really, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's why we go to school at the beginning of our lives and not the end. It's because this knowledge compounds and we build on top of it. And this is the thing with finance, is that you could probably get across, like, just by listening to this podcast, you could probably get across 90 to 95% of what you need to know just by listening, just by reading occasionally. And you could probably do that, honestly, within 3 to 6 months. Not even, like, and I'm only talking a few minutes each day. It's one of those things. It's like health. You got to have a very basic understanding of the fundamentals just to get by. And I don't think enough people have that in finance, which is a shame. But yet it's something that's unavoidable, like health. So now is the time to do it. Now is the time, if you do have capital, you can start to put it to work. If you need money from investing, you should not be investing. If you're going to put a deposit down on a property in the next year or two, do not consider investing that. Just keep saving. You're doing a good thing.
No investing that emergency fund.
No emergency fund investing.
Now's the time that we actually want the emergency fund. And if you don't have an emergency fund, that's the first port of call. I mean, that 10K might help you actually have an emergency fund if you've got no cash at all. So definitely make sure you have, because we don't know how long this is going to go on for. So you definitely know investing the 10K if you don't have any other funds available to supplement you over the next few to many, many months. Who knows? Yeah, absolutely. And if you are one of these people, or one of these people that are not necessarily responsible with money, it is not a good idea to take $10,000 out of super, period.
It's there for a reason. It's there for your future. If you can't invest it and you can't do something with it healthily, then it's best off staying where it is. Because as you said, a lot of these super funds do have kind of this multi-decade view and investment horizon that most people can't match. So don't be fooled into thinking that, hey, you are a great investor just because you bought, 1 or 2 shares and you've made some money. Don't be fooled into thinking that you're not going to spend the money if you have a history of spending on things that are probably inappropriate for you longer term. All of these things that we're going to talk you off the ledge as much as we can. But if you do believe that, you've got your debts under control, you can use this to pay for bills or juice your emergency fund or invest for the long term, then it is a healthy decision, I believe, that you can make. Okay, Kate, as we come to the back end of this, we've talked about different strategies. We've talked about everything else. There is one little thing Kate and I wanted to mention, which is, as most listeners of this podcast will know, I run an investment service for people, and we're offering a discount for the next week for anyone that joins us. So if you join our service, you get $100 off. You'll find a link in the show notes for that, and as well as the code. It's only for Finance Podcast listeners, and it's a code that goes on our website when you choose to join us. So if you want to do that. And
this service provides?
Oh, yes, I should say. What it does. Okay, so as
a new and improved Rask Invest 2.0.
That's it, yeah. So we've recently relaunched our websites, and we have our memberships back. So we have 2 different memberships. We have one just for ETF investors, which we provide research for. So you could sign up and you would get, say, research on the top 10 ETFs that we suggest. The other one, which is our Rask Invest service, which is the top one, this provides all of my research on shares and ETFs. It's like weekly commentary videos, question and answer sessions, all of these types of things. We don't provide one-on-one financial planning advice, but it's all online, and we help people understand investing and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, that's why you would consider signing up, because you want to take the steps to start investing and you want to know where to invest. And you can get $100 off if you use the code, which will be in your podcast player.
And sometimes it's really helpful when you're getting started to see what someone that's actually done it before is doing, what sort of shares and ETFs they're buying. So it's definitely a helpful tool right now to use if you are thinking about investing and getting started.
Yeah. I think that was really well said, Kate. I think a magpie just made a noise in the background too, so it was perfect. But that's Kate and I's first attempt at just trying to market something that we benefit from. If you want to learn more about it, you'll find links in your podcast player. But have a look at that. And I just want to say to everyone, I hope you're staying healthy. I hope you're staying well. Kate and I talked about some of the unfortunate things that have come about as a result of isolation. And I just hope that you're well. As always, you can reach out to us if you need support. We're available on the website. We have links to Beyond Blue, to free financial counseling, we can even set you up with financial planners. We can do all of those things if you need a helping hand. At a time like now, everyone needs to pitch in and just do what they can for each other. So you know where to reach us.
Yeah, flick us an email or a DM and we'd love to have a chat.
Yeah, absolutely would. So as always, Kate, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Owen. And if you wanted to find me, you can get me at howtomoney.online or Instagram and Twitter at howtomoneyAUS.
Yep, and I'm at Owen Rask on Twitter. I think I'm at Owen Rask on Instagram. Goes to show how much I use it. I do have a TikTok account though.
Oh,
hey, I do have a TikTok, so I'm on it. Yeah, actually, no, I got it and I deactivated it because I was on it too much. Anyway, that's a story for next time. Kate, as always, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for listening, guys.